Chapter 15. Reconstruction. Late 1860s. Scallywag, a scamp, rascal in the South. The scallywag supported Republicans and freeing slaves. It was a relief to know that the war was over, but the general conditions in the South were often dire. The devastation and hurt couldn't go away any time soon, because Jenny Harness had worked her farmstead and God had protected her from harm. She fared better than some who had lost everything. I read an account of a man passing through what later became Boone County and into Marion County, who spoke of how improvised some were. I will try to retell this from memory, as I cannot find the story as told. It was at the time that many farmsteads had been burned out or abandoned throughout the hills. Some men were driving a herd of cows to Yellville, Arkansas, from Carroll County. As the men drove the herd east, they came across the grassy prairies of Carroll County, later Boone County, where the cows fed. As the drivers moved on, a few stray cows joined the herd. The cows had no markings to show ownership, but appeared to be mavericks. So the men didn't cut them out of the herd, and the strays followed along with them as they moved into the area bordering Marion County. Along the way, they had noticed many farmsteads burned out in the area. Few people remained, and most former farms were abandoned. As the men and cows followed a rugged trail along a cliff area, they came to a large bluff shelter, where some women came out into the daylight to watch the herd pass by. The lead herdsman then described the condition of the women as gaunt and dirty and lacking for decent clothing. He noticed that they had taken scraps of clothing and patched them together to have some coverage of their bodies. He told how they had taken twigs and vines to pin the edges together, as they had no thread and needle to sew the scraps together. Barefooted and disheveled, they stood like corpses as the men and cows were passing them by. It was in that moment that the lead herdsman felt compassion for the women and instructed his men to cut the maverick cows out of the herd that had been following them. Turning to the women, he told them that he could not give them any of the cows they had been hired to move, but the stray cows were not his to have or to give. He left the mavericks with those women to use however they willed. For those desperate women, it was a miracle of kindness and sympathy that the men had shown them out of compassion. As the women took possession of the cows, a previously unseen elderly woman presented herself, who was impoverished in appearance as the other women. Coming out into the daylight from the cave with hands held high toward heaven, in a broken but elevated voice, she was giving glory to God for looking upon their afflictions with mercy. The lead herdsman later wrote of the event and told how it moved him to see those women come to life with hope from the provisions. But the older woman had moved him beyond words to see and hear her worship God for His goodness. What would become of women like those who were left without any men to protect and provide for them? Many would vanish from weakness made by hunger and sickness. The average woman only lived into their 40s before they succumbed to the ravages of deprivation and general imperilment of the environment. The account of those women living in a cave brings realization of how hard it was to survive as a victim of the war between the states and the awful wretchedness caused by bushwhackers. The real war in much of North Arkansas was not as much between states as it was defenseless families against terrorists. Jenny Harness did not suffer the level of poverty that some had. Able to feed herself and the boys with provisions they worked hard for, God granted her strength and health to make it through those terrible times. Each day brought them threats of destructions, but every day also brought the provisions of God they needed to survive. Jenny knew she could only do so much, and that the Almighty had to do for them what they could not do or control. With plenty to worry about, she chose faith over fear, and she lived far beyond the expected years of most women. Neighbors called her Aunt Jenny out of respect and belief that she was their kin in friendship and faith. The turbulence from the assassination of President Lincoln and the surrendering of General Lee's army to Grant made the new President Andrew Johnson begin a process of using civil authority to restore the Southern states to the Union. Emancipation of 3 million slaves in the South and newly appointed civil leaders in government, who Southerners called carpetbaggers and scalawags, were not trusted. Their distrust continued the flames of rebellion and the evil-doers known as bushwhackers, who still lingered in the remote hills. Soon they gave birth to outlaw gangs that went looking for bigger prizes than cornmeal, bacon, and a horse. One outlaw gang that appeared in Searcy County became known as the James Younger Gang. They were mostly Confederate bushwhackers from Missouri, but for nearly a decade they would spread out over 11 states, killing and robbing banks, trains, and individuals who had money. The Younger brothers belonged to a slave-owning family in western Missouri, nicknamed Little Dixie for its strong ties to the South during the war. The death of their father at the hands of Union forces is thought to have made them turn to being Confederate bushwhackers, leading them to becoming outlaws. Joining up with the infamous James Boys, together they became known as the James Younger Gang. Mary Hayes, 1846-1944, wrote the following about them coming to Searcy County. The James Boys were in Searcy County frequently, accompanied by the Younger brothers Cole, Bob, and Jim. On one occasion, after a typical James Boys raid in southern Missouri and the usual temporary split-up of the gang, Frank, Jesse James, and Cole Younger drifted into the town of Marshall, Arkansas. A few days later, a young lady was riding home from a neighbor's when Cole Younger accosted her. She ordered him away, as she knew who he was, but he began to curse the lady, trying to push her off her horse, and finally drawing his pistol and threatening to kill her. Finally, he rode on, and the lady reported the incident to her uncle, who gathered a posse and started after the James gang. They finally, after a running fight, forced them to hole up in a settler's cabin. After a siege of about 30 hours, Cole Younger sent for this young lady, who was in a crowd of women, the wives of the posse men. The young lady went to the side of the cabin, and Younger wanted her to beg the possemen to let the James gang get away, and contrary to their usual code, Cole Younger apologized to the lady. The lady finally consented to ask the possemen to allow the James Boys to go their way, but the possemen refused. However, a short while later, at dusk, the James gang dug beneath the walls of the cabin and escaped despite a rain of lead from the old squirrel rifles. Written by Mary Elizabeth Shaw Hayes. Jenny and her boys undoubtedly heard many tales about outlaws roaming through the Ozark Hills. It might have added to their angst about staying in the hollow, but they had made it thus far, and their faith in God made them stay. For now, it was one old hen and 2 poults. For any not knowing what a poult is, it's a growing bird. Poultry is the farming practice of growing birds. In the future, North Arkansas became home to many large poultry houses. Reflection: few of us today in America have any experience of living in such sheer poverty as some of our ancestors had to endure. Our appreciation for basic needs of water, food, and shelter are too often taken for granted. I hope that reading stories like these will help us who live in prosperous times to stop and be thankful for the abundance we receive daily. May we be a generation of harnesses who don't forget our heritage. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Psalm 46, 1-2. End note. Civil War devastation was so pronounced that refugees returning in 1866 to 1870 from Missouri, Kansas, Illinois, and the federal post at Lewisburg, now Morrilton in Conway County, had to rebuild from scratch. A wooden courthouse was built in about 1868, and merchants and saloon keepers opened new businesses. A government still, grist mill and cotton gin, about a mile west of Marshall at Springtown, provided a small industrial push. Eggs and other local produce were shipped out on freight wagons. Despite the mountainous terrain, cotton was the principal cash crop and was shipped through Marshall. Cattle and even flocks of turkeys were driven to market in Little Rock.